My guest today is Professor Susan Alberts, who's Professor of Biology and Evolutionary Anthropology and the Chair of the Evolutionary Anthropology Department at Duke University. She studies the behavior, ecology, physiology, and genetics of wild populations of large mammals. Welcome, Susan.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for doing this. So I want to start with one of your papers from 2019, Intergenerational Effects of Early Adversity on Survival in Wild Baboons. I found this really fascinating. Susan, I know nothing about it, but thinking about the intergenerational effects is really amazing. So you say here early life adversity can affect an individual's health, survival, and fertility for many years after the adverse experience. Whether early life adversity also imposes intergenerational effects on the exposed individual's offspring is not well understood. So what's the mechanism here? How does it have intergenerational effect? Um, so we're talking about baboons here, but I would imagine it's extensible to other mammals too, I would think, right?
Well, and in fact, the question is really motivated by research on humans, in which we know that early adverse circumstances are associated with poor health and with shortened lifespan. And in fact, the effects in humans are quite marked. They're very strong effects. And in non-human animals, for many years, we've known that early adversity can affect, that early adverse circumstances can affect fertility. But I think that our study was the first to show that it can affect longevity as well. And the question of how early life adversity gets under the skin, not only to affect the individual's own life trajectory, but that of its offspring, is a really complex one. The big picture answer is we don't know yet. There are a number of mechanisms that are possible. One of the things that we think is very likely in the case of these intergenerational effects is that it's a fairly simple, what you might call, what ecologists and evolutionary biologists call a parental effect. It's a maternal effect, in that the body condition of the mother, the physical condition of the mother, that her physiology, her behavior, are shaped by her early life environment, and it's that maternal environment. It's her behavior, physiology that affect her offspring's development. That's not the only possibility. It could be that there is some sort of epigenetic programming that is set in motion by the mother's early life adversity. But a more parsimonious and simpler explanation is just a direct maternal effect. And we think that that's what's going on in the baboons. It doesn't really answer the question of how maternal early adversity gets under the skin. And we're working on that. One possibility is that if a female has adverse early environments, then she's just not as good a mother. That's an entirely possible thing. To the extent that we've looked at it so far, we're in the early stages of examining that. We don't find a lot of evidence for that. It's not, there's no obvious way in which females with more early adversity are suckling their offspring less or carrying their offspring less. But what we are seeing, and this is work led by my former PhD student, Matthew Zippel, who's now a postdoc at Cornell University, what we do see is that females with more early life adversity, once they grow up and become adults and have their own offspring, they have an inclination, they have a tendency to spend more time with adult males, which is really interesting. What we don't know is whether that effect is bad for their kids, hence potentially one of the mechanisms that causes poor offspring survival, or whether it's actually something that mitigates the other negative effects the mother experienced from early adversity, whether it actually helps reduce the effect of maternal early adversity on offspring survival. So that's what we're really curious about.
Yeah. So in some sense, it's sort of a resource allocation problem here. As you mentioned, if you have adversity, perhaps you have less time and how you allocate that time is becoming more constrained.
Yeah.
And this idea that the females tend to spend more time with their partners is also sort of a resource allocation issue. A lot of things are going through my mind, Susan. So I just want to take a quick detour on the human side. I mean, we have always known that initial conditions matter a lot
Hmm.
for development.
Hmm.
Um, this has implications for healthcare. It has implications for how do we really think about, sort of early interventions in families that are resource constrained. Adversity could come in a lot of different flavors, I would think. And so, have you thought about that? I mean, do you see some sort of a policy implications on the human side?
Yeah, in fact, that's a really important question, and it's one of the things that really motivated some of this research, because in the human literature, the presence of early life adversity not only predicts later life health and survival, it also predicts later life health habits. Individuals who had more early life adversity tend also to smoke more. They tend to exercise less. There's a whole, and they often have poor socioeconomic status, which means access to less health care. And so in the human literature, it seems clear that a lot of the effect of early adversity is sort of mediated by these adult health habits and health or healthcare environments. Um, but in the baboon, but probably not all of it. And in the baboons, we found an effect nearly as strong as the effect of early life adversity in humans. And there's no health habits in the baboons. Everybody's eating the
Right.
same thing. Nobody's
Right.
smoking. There's no socioeconomic variation. Um, and so that suggests that the early life adversity itself is where you need to intervene. And so we do think that that's a sort of translational outcome of some of the work that we do. Did that answer the question?
Yeah, it does. It does. So, in some sense, having some sort of a special status for mothers has huge societal value, I would think.
Yeah.
Just to make clear for the audience, it is quite profound. You say here, we find that juveniles whose mothers experience early life adversity exhibit high mortality before age 4, independent of the juvenile's own experience of early adversity. So
Yeah.
this is a shock that happened before
Yeah.
before the kid is born, right?
It's what they come to the table with. Yeah. Just because of who their mothers are. Actually, can we go back to the policy implication just briefly? Because
Yeah.
there was another piece of that thought that I wanted to complete. So another question that I think is quite pressing in the human literature that's difficult to answer in the human literature, just because we're so long lived and we don't really yet have that much data on individuals from birth to death in large numbers with really fine-grained data on every stage of their life. There are some, and those data sets are growing. But so a big question in the human literature is, to what extent are the effects of early life and the known effects of adulthood independent, or to what extent do the effects of adulthood simply mediate the effects of early life, right? So for
Right.
instance, another thing we know about humans is that stronger social bonds are associated with higher survival. And it's possible that those stronger social bonds are simply reflecting the effects of early life adversity, so that the predominant force in an individual's life is early life adversity. And if you don't intervene in early life, you've lost your chance. But another possibility is that adult environments have their own independent effects and maybe even have the possibility of moderating or mitigating the effects of early life adversity. And that's another question that we've tackled in our study population. And I'll say, much to my surprise, we found that both early life and adult social environments have independent effects on survival. And in fact, there is the potential for adult social environments to moderate the effects of early life adversity. So while we do need to intervene in early life, it suggests that interventions in adulthood are not without consequence, and there's potential there too.
So there could be interventions at different points in time, or perhaps all through one's life.
Yeah.
So if you sort of think about this as a diagnosis early on, and then it's sort of a chronic condition for that individual,
Yeah.
that you can possibly treat in some way, right? So you have another paper here that is very well connected to what you're talking about here. So 2021, social bonds, social status, and survival in wild baboons, a tale of two sexes. Before we get into the variations in sexes, you said people who are more socially integrated or have high socioeconomic status live longer. And we can clearly see that in the data, even in people. And recent studies in non-human primates, you say, show striking convergence with this human pattern. And so this is what you were talking about, right? So if people are well adjusted, they have a lot of social bonds. There's this question of social status, which is interesting. How do you define social status here?
So I'm going to talk about the human literature, and then I'm going to talk about how we think about it in baboons, because this is one of the areas where baboons appear to be quite different from humans, very interestingly. So in humans, you can measure social status as income, as grade of work, or as educational level. And with each of those types of definition, you get this profound, pervasive effect of social status on survival, on longevity. Social scientists use the phrase fundamental cause of inequalities in health and survival to refer to social status. It's really a big effect, and it's quite consistent in the human populations where it's been studied, that higher status individuals have longer lives. In the baboons, what's very interesting, and in non-human primates in general, the effect is less consistent for social status than it is for social bonds, from what we know now. And in Ambicelli, in my study population of baboons, what we see is that social status, independent of social bonds, is not affecting female survival. It does affect male survival, but the effect is weaker than it is in humans, and it's in the opposite direction, which is really intriguing. High-ranking males who maintain high rank for their age throughout their life tend to live shorter lives than males who are lower ranking for their age. And I say for their age because in baboons, rank is strongly age correlated. Males reach their highest rank when they're young and in their prime, between 9 and 11, and then they fall in rank throughout their lives. In primates, social status, rank, is measured basically by fighting ability. And that's different than in humans. In humans, social status is multidimensional and may involve income, may sometimes involve competitive abilities measured directly, but usually not fighting ability. So there's a difference in how they're defined, and there's a difference in their outcome for health and survival. I think of male baboons as sort of living pursuing a live fast, die young strategy, whereas male humans appear not to do that, right? They're playing a longer game, and social status often increases with age in humans.
Yeah, so without knowing much about it, Susan, my intuition is that, so in the case of baboons, you see high-ranked, high-status males living shorter lives. So I wondered it is related to stress. I mean, when you are top of the ladder, sometimes, you have more stress. So I wonder if there's some sort of an inverted U relationship, sort of things in the middle appear to be stress optimal.
Yeah, that was a nice question, because it allows me to segue to a couple of other bodies of research that we're pursuing. So my colleague Jenny Tung and her laboratory, her PhD student Jordan Anderson was one of the leaders of this work. are looking at epigenetic aging and trying to understand how some individuals age faster than others based on their epigenetic signatures, based on their patterns of gene expression, if you will. There's a well-known epigenetic clock in humans, patterns of gene expression, patterns of marks on the DNA that affect gene expression change with age. And some individuals seem to age relatively. So there's a clock. It's called an epigenetic clock that you can use to sort of, if you just get someone's blood sample and look at their patterns of gene expression, or really marks on the DNA methylation, for those of your listeners who know what that is, you can estimate their age. But there's variance around that. Some individuals are old for their age, some are young for their age on this epigenetic clock. And what Jordan and Jenny found in the Amboseli baboons is that high-ranking males have faster epigenetic aging than low-ranking males. So that's exactly the point you raised, Gill. And we also know that the highest-ranking male in the group is typically showing he's secreting a lot of glucocorticoid hormones, which are sometimes called a stress hormone. That's a bad shorthand name for them. Basically, what they do is they prepare the body for a challenge. And if you're secreting a lot of glucocorticoids, it means you're always ready for a challenge, whether it's an energetic challenge or a psychosocial challenge. High-ranking males have high glucocorticoids. So there's other bits of evidence to suggest that what male baboons are doing is live fast, die young, pay a cost of rank in the short term, but benefit from it by getting lots of access to reproductive opportunities.
Yeah, I was thinking, I wonder on the human side, there's some indication that the corporate rat race, let's call it, of the high status humans tend to actually reduce lifespan, and again related to stress. So you have corticoid. I don't know much about it, Susan. So it is a marker, isn't it? So you say here we document a powerful link between GCs, which is glucocorticoid, and survival. Females with relatively high current GCs or high lifelong cumulative GCs face an elevated risk of death. Lifelong cumulative GCs. So these are things that don't get taken out of the system after it's created. It sort of accumulates over time.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So you're referring to our 2021 paper led by my former postdoc Fernando Campos. So it's not that what's cumulative. What we're referring to is how is sort of the amount of exposure your body has had to the glucocorticoids you're secreting, right? So if your hypothalamic pituitary axis, adrenal axis is sort of constantly stimulated to secrete glucocorticoids, then you're going to have, by the time you reach age 10 years old, you're going to have been exposed to a good deal more glucocorticoid secretion than if your HPA axis is stimulated to produce less. And that's what we're measuring when we say cumulative exposure. And indeed, we did find that for females, we don't have this data for males. It's more difficult to get for male baboons because they leave the group they were born into around the time they reach adulthood, and then they can move between groups. So it's very easy for them to leave our study population. Whereas females pretty much remain in our study population throughout their lives. And indeed, this hypothesis has been circulating in the human literature for some time that part of how adverse circumstances get under the skin is because they trigger your HPA axis to just secrete too many glucocorticoids. That's been really difficult to test in humans because you can't just keep collecting glucocorticoid samples for humans for decades and see what happens to them. Those studies typically will collect 2 or 3 or maybe 4 samples of saliva for cortisol analysis over about a decade towards the end of a person, when a person is somewhat older. And our guess is that that's pretty noisy. The data we had come from fecal samples. So every time a baboon defecates, we collect it, and we then can get a number of things out of that fecal sample, including steroid hormone concentrations. Glucocorticoids are a steroid hormone. And so we can measure for individual females over the course. For some females, we have 15 years of fecal samples that gives us a very good estimate of. It's noisy if you've just got 1 or 2 samples per individual, but we had many. We had about 14,500 samples for about 200 females over the courses of their lives. And that's how we were able to ask that question that's been very difficult to ask in humans.
Yeah, it makes a lot of intuitive sense, right? It's a bit like radiation. So it's essentially sort of the area under the curve of exposure. And what you're finding here is that total exposure has some correlation to lifespan, which makes a lot of sense. And as you say, it's very difficult to do in humans. I want to go into another topic. So in 2021, you have a paper, Better Baboon Breakups, Collective Decision Theory of Complex Social Network Fissions. So you say here, many social groups are made up of complex social networks in which each individual associates with a distinct subset of his group mates. If social groups become larger over time, competition often leads to a permanent group fission. It's a bit like for humans, we have this thing called Dunbar number, right? So when we took off 200,000 years ago, clan sizes maybe maybe a dozen, a few dozens, and we quickly found out that when we hit 150, things really break down. And so this is happening here also in the case of baboons, right?
Yeah. Well, so I think you're asking about the process of fission, yeah? When a group fissions. Yeah, I mean, it's quite interesting. It does look as though, and honestly, it's a time constraint. The baboons have a time budget, right? They have to work a certain number of hours a day just to survive. And that work involves foraging, getting enough calories, and getting water into your body so that you can keep going and you can reproduce. And the discretionary time they have to decide how to allocate it between resting and socializing. And social life is very important for baboons, as for most primates and all social mammals. And figuring out, there's an allocation problem. And it looks to us from our data as though there is a sort of, as group size increases, you increase the number of connections you have, but there's an asymptote, right? You can't just keep going up and up and up. The question of what drives a fission. So one of the interesting things about that paper, which was led by a PhD student at UNC Chapel Hill, Brian Lurch, very nice piece of work that he led, and we're happy that he collaborated with us on that. His question was, what does the process look like? But you're also asking what drives the decision to fission at all. And it is almost certainly a combination of intra-group competition for resources and an inability to keep a cohesive social network, group-wide social network, as groups get larger and larger. We think of baboon groups. So human social groups have this very interesting property where they're permeable to outside individuals. And in fact, the boundaries of a human social group are not only quite permeable, except when they're not, except when people decide there's a hard boundary and we're going to go to war to protect that boundary. In general, they're permeable, and they can sort of move farther or closer to an individual depending on their social context, and to what extent they feel threatened versus the extent to which they need allies. Baboon groups are different. The boundaries of a baboon group are pretty well defined, and they're not really that permeable. They're not that permeable to females. They're permeable to males in the dispersal context, but mostly a baboon group is a baboon group is a baboon group. I mean, everybody knows who's in it. But a baboon group of any given size has two competition problems. It's got a problem of competition within the group, and then it's got a problem of competition with other groups. So it's got a within group competition problem and a between group competition problem. Small groups are pretty privileged when it comes to within group competition because there's not that many individuals you're competing with. Okay. But they're disadvantaged when it comes to between group competition because they're small. And they can't necessarily go to a waterhole anytime they want if there's a bigger group using that waterhole. Big groups are privileged when it comes to between group competition, but the within group tension, the within group competition is probably what eventually drives it apart and causes a fission. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. I mean, I'm thinking, you can see small companies are much more effective in innovation. They work together a lot better. But competing with a Fortune 100 is difficult for them, right? Yeah. It's sort of a similar issue here,
Absolutely.
Right? So it's an optimization problem.
Exactly.
And so as the groups grow, so do we have some sort of algorithm? You talk about here democracy, community, and so on, fission algorithms, you say. Yeah. So have you figured out how they do this, how they reach this point at which they sort of split?
Yeah, well, that was exactly Brian's question. So he wasn't so interested in what is causing them to fission. Other people have worked on that problem of, that you identified as something that affects every ecosystem, whether it's the corporate ecosystem or a primate ecosystem or honestly anyone, which is anyone that's organized, that's subdivided where individuals are subdivided into groups. There's a within group versus a between group interaction and competition problem. But Brian was interested in the question of what does the process look like? And he's the one who developed the democratic algorithm, the democracy algorithm, the community algorithm, and the despotic algorithm. And he compared, in each case, he had sort of two sets of questions. One was, among these theoretical algorithms, not paying attention to the baboon behavior, which one performs best in terms of creating a fission of two relatively equal-sized groups without breaking too many bonds? And then he asked the question, the next question, which was, well, what do the baboons look like? What do their outcomes look like? And what he found is that the baboons, in terms of the outcome of the fission, looks very much like a democratic algorithm, but they're not nearly as efficient as as his computational process that he came up with, right? Which is a simple set of rules that says, if you're the first individual, do this. If you're the second individual, do this. If you're the third individual, do that. And that's almost certainly reflecting the fact, well, two things. One is that the baboons are optimizing in multiple dimensions. They're not just optimizing one thing, which is what we looked at in the algorithms, the strongest social bonds. They're optimizing other things. Like, for instance, their social rank in the resulting group is a possibility for what they might be trying to optimize. But the other thing is they have quite imperfect communication. They're quite constrained in trying, and they're all simultaneously trying to optimize at the same time. And everything you do, your outcome is dependent on what other individuals do. So you're probably pretty vulnerable to mistakes, and that means that you may make an initial decision thinking you're going to have this outcome, but then another individual on whom your outcome depends makes another decision, and then you have to reassess, and that's going to create an inefficient process. It's much more efficient to talk it through.
I remember you saying somewhere here, Susan, that there's temporary fissions and permanent fissions.
Yeah.
If I understand it correctly, so if a fission happens, it's temporary. That doesn't mean that they actually come back together at some point.
Yes, yeah, and in fact, let me just digress slightly here, and explain that among animal societies, including human societies, um, there are sort of two ways to think about social groups. One is in the context of what we call a fission-fusion society, where fissions and fusions are happening constantly. And humans are a fission-fusion society. The social group that you're in right now is different than the social group that you'll be in later tonight. Tomorrow you'll be in a different one, and so on. That's a fission-fusion society. There are other fission-fusion societies. African elephants are fission-fusion. Spotted hyenas are somewhat fission-fusion. Chimpanzees are somewhat fission-fusion, although they also have a pretty hard community boundary. All the fissioning and fusing in a chimpanzee group occurs in the context of a hard community boundary, and then there's fissioning and fusioning within that. But the other type, the non-fission fusion type of society, is a permanent social group society, and that's what baboons live in. They live in a permanent social group society, and so when a permanent social group goes through a fission, that is a process rather than an event, and the process will often involve sort of temporary subgrouping, where the animals might split into two groups or even three groups for a few hours or even a day or two, and then come back together and reassort. And then they might fission again in a week or two, and then come back together and reassort and fission again. And what we've seen in the fissions that we've seen in Ambocelli is that over time, the composition of those subgroups in terms of which individuals join which subgroup becomes more and more predictable and more stable. And at some point, they're spending more time apart than they are together. And that's when we call that fission permanent.
So it's a process that ultimately gets them there. In an ironic way, Susan, it seems like we can't really run these experiments in humans anymore because, we have Facebook, we have internet, all those things are interfering with our, sort of how we used to live. And so we have to look at non-human primates to really understand what the heck is going on. Once we perhaps we can give one group of baboons Facebook and see if they, if everything changes for them.
Well, actually, I think that a bigger change than social media, which has been huge in how humans interact, was the sort of rise of the state, right? Originally, it's thought that humans lived in small bands. And at some point, they aggregated when people settled and figured out that they could farm food, raise crops, and herd animals. People started to settle, and then you got larger aggregations than you had ever seen over the course of human history, and government structures started to form, and I think that was probably the biggest shift in thinking about how humans probably functioned. I think there was certainly conflict before then, intergroup conflict before then, but the more settled and larger a human group is, the more likely it's going to be in conflict with another group, I think. So, yeah, but social media does, everything's on the table. It's all, we're reinventing things on a daily basis.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Susan. I was thinking, so we can see there is a size issue. So we can look at Scandinavian countries, we can look at New Zealand, we can look at countries that's less than 10 million people. They behave certain way. And then we can look at these large systems, the US, India, China. They are totally different. A lot of conflicts going on. In fact, one could argue these countries are not a single country, but perhaps multiple countries, right? So there is a sort of an optimization question there too, I think.
Well, and it's interesting because that connects back to something we were talking about earlier, which is the sort of great permeability of human social groups. And I think that one of the things that I should say, I'm talking about human behavior here as if I know anything about it. I'm an animal behavior person, but of course I do have thoughts about human behavior, which I'm going to share now. I hope that's okay. So, I think that one of the really fascinating things about what differentiates one country from another in terms of its internal conflict has to do with the extent to which people in that country consider themselves all members of the same in-group, as opposed to perceiving themselves as a heterogeneous mix of people with lots of different interests and lots of different affinities. And, to some extent, honestly, that's all artificial, because ultimately we're all human and we have pretty similar interests, but we do very passionately identify individuals with whom we decide we share interests and who we decide we want to defend. We can base those decisions on all sorts of things, none of which are terribly rational because they're all sort of a cultural overlay. But I think it's an evolutionary holdover of humans that of our past, that we're able to both allow almost anybody we want into our in-group, but also force barriers that say, no, you arbitrarily are a member of the out-group, and therefore I'm going to wage war on you. Sometimes, of course, those conflicts are over resources that are defined by state boundaries, but within societies, they tend to be more arbitrary, and yeah.
Yeah. So larger systems have more flexibility. The design space is a lot bigger. You have a lot more optionality in the sense that you can pretty much go in a lot of different directions. In a small system, you're sort of constrained from that, and so that also sort of feeds into it. I want to go back to the primate studies that you have. So this one from 2021, maternal death and offspring fitness in multiple wild primates. You say primate offspring often depend on their mothers well beyond the age of weaning, and offspring that experience maternal death in early life can suffer substantial reductions in fitness across a lifespan. This is related to what we were talking about before, but this is sort of a specific event, right, that you can look at and how that affects. So what's the data you're using here?
So this is the result of a wonderful collaboration between 7 different long-term studies of primates. One study is on muriquis in Brazil. They're a fascinating New World primate, very complex society, quite egalitarian, not only between the sexes, but within each sex. There's not a lot of evidence for strong social gradients, social status, that kind of thing. So muriquis, the mountain gorillas made famous by the Dian Fossey studies, the chimpanzees made famous by Jane Goodall, the Amboseli baboons, 2 studies of capuchin monkeys in Costa Rica, and a study of shifaka, which is a lemur-like animal in Madagascar, and then blue monkeys in the rainforests of Western Kenya. And we've been collaborating as a group. These 7 different primate studies have been collaborating since about 2005. That work was actually initiated. It was sort of the brainchild of Karen Stryer at the University of Wisconsin, who leads the Muriqui project. And we decided that our data and the world would benefit if we carefully designed a database that sort of standardized information, life history information about these individuals, and recorded in a similar way for all these studies informations about births, deaths, and various other life events. And so that data set is now available for study. And again, my student Matthew Zippel decided, after we found this effect of maternal death of maternal early adversity on baboon infant survival, we decided to ask it more broadly. And it was a really interesting study because it revealed both the universals among primates in terms of the vulnerability of infants who lose their mothers, and some unique patterns where infants are less vulnerable. For instance, in the gorillas and the capuchins, in gorillas, if you lose your mother under the age of 2, your survival is very compromised. But if you lose your mother after the age of 2 years, which is common in gorillas because female gorillas disperse. They'll move between social groups, sometimes leaving young offspring behind. But what those offspring do is they diversify their social network and they form strong bonds with males and with other group members. This isn't my work. This is the work of Tara Stowinski and her student Robin Morrison. And so gorillas somehow escape this negative consequence of maternal loss as long as they're weaned. Capuchins are another one who seem not to be too negatively affected by maternal loss. Again, possibly because capuchins do a lot of what we call allomothering, where other individuals in the group will care for offspring. So, but other than that, there does seem to be this quite pervasive effect. Even if you're weaned, losing your mother is not good if you're a primate. And that's almost certainly the case because primates are very socially complex. And once you're nutritionally independent, you still have a lot to learn, and your mother is probably one of your main sources of information.
So how do you define offspring fitness here? What is sort of the construct?
Yeah, in this case, so fitness from an evolutionary perspective is really just a function of how long you live and how many offspring you have. There's different ways to measure it, and population geneticists measure it one way, behavioral ecologists measure it another way, but ultimately it's really a question of how effectively you're getting your genes into the next generation. We only looked at offspring survival. That's a very simple component of fitness, because if you don't survive to reproductive age, your fitness is 0. So that's what we meant by offspring fitness. It's did you survive or not? And it's an evolutionary fitness, not a health-oriented kind of fitness.
But presumably, in the data, you can find other factors that potentially sort of expands the fitness definition.
Yeah. So one of the things that we're curious about but haven't done an analysis of yet is the extent to which a mother's early adversity affects other aspects of her offspring's life. And we don't know that yet. What we do know, interestingly, my colleague Fernando Campos, again, has been looking at the extent to which, as females age, their offspring are better or worse off by having older mothers. And we've looked at offspring survival and found what we just talked about, that, well, I guess we didn't discuss that as females age, in many but not all primate species, offspring survival is compromised for older mothers. And also, we looked at the age at which a daughter first reaches reproductive maturity. And in a couple of species, it looks like that's also affected by maternal age. But the whole question of these intergenerational effects on offspring fitness is still in the very early stages of investigation.
Yeah, I don't know if it's in this paper or the previous one, Susan. I remember you saying if the mother is sick, she hasn't died yet,
yeah,
but she is sick. That in itself has a pronounced effect, right?
Yeah, and in fact, that appeared in both of those papers. And that was another pretty consistent effect across all 7 primate species. Not all of them, I think 5 of the 7, if I recall correctly. And we didn't measure maternal sickness, but what we asked was, did the mother die in the subsequent 2-year period? And if she did, the offspring was more likely to die even before their mother died. suggesting that maternal body condition, even before observers can detect that there's anything wrong with the female, that maternal body condition is starting to decline seriously enough that offspring survival is compromised. Now, what's really interesting about that in the baboons, and we don't know this yet for the other species, is that we don't see much effect of maternal age on simple birth rate, right? Just how frequently you conceive. But we do see this very strong effect of maternal age on offspring survival. It really seems clear that from the perspective, I'm going to assert, I think this is true, from the perspective of a primate female, this is not true for all mammals or all organisms, but I think it's true for primates, that getting pregnant and having the baby is the easy part. The hard part for a primate is getting that kid through to weaning, through to adulthood, really. And I think it's because primates are so socially complex and have so much growth and development they have to do, and that's a demand on the mother. And I think that explains why in baboons we don't see much, we see some, but not a huge effect of maternal age on just plain old birth rate. What we see a stronger effect of is maternal age on offspring survival.
Yeah, I was thinking through this, and on the human side, the culture, societal structure, all of that could matter, right? So potentially we may find huge variations across cultures, how close they are. The presence of the mother may be extremely important in certain cultures, maybe less so, just like you found other primates. I wonder if you will find variations among human cultures.
There's absolutely no question. And one of the things that evolutionary biologists are increasingly realizing and have a consensus about with respect to humans is that humans evolved as sort of communal breeders. We raise our offspring communally to an extent that is very uncommon or absent in other primates. And one of the ways you can see this, or one of the pieces of evidence that supports this, is that human inner birth intervals in uncontracepted natural populations are really quite short for our body size. Most mammals, if you know the body size, you can sort of predict what the fertility rate is going to be, what the inner birth interval is going to be, because there's very strong correlations among body size, longevity, and birth rate, and various other what we call life history traits. In humans, we have a very high birth rate for our body size. We just pack them in very tightly. And it's almost certainly the case that we can do that because the whole community, the village, raises the child, right? And the calories that a child consumes as it develops, and humans tend to be net consumers of calories, according to studies of hunter-gatherers, until well into their late teens or even early 20s. They don't become net producers until they're nearly adult or well into adulthood. Once they become net producers, then they produce a lot of calories, and that's how we can then support these young developing organisms who are net consumers for more than a decade, more than 15 years, they're net consumers. And that is almost certainly, that strategy demands a social approach to raising offspring. And it's also the case, to get back to your question, that different societies approach that problem differently. Some are much more, well, the kid is yours, and if you die, we'll make some effort toward it, but we're not going to, invest hugely. Other societies are much more, well, there's adoption and there's, and there's also variation among individuals, right? So there's societal variation and there's individual variation. So I think your instinct is right that there's going to be a lot of variation in human cultures in the extent to which offspring are compromised if their mother dies. Now, there's actually quite a lot of literature in that in humans, and we know that to be true. And we know that in general, losing your mother is not a good thing for humans. But yeah.
Yeah, I know that this is not your research, Susan, but I was wondering, humans used to have high reproductive rates, not anymore. It has been declining quite dramatically. Replacement rate is, 2.1. It is expected that we will hit 1.75 in like 30 years or something like that. Human population is now expected to peak around 2060 and decline rapidly. So clearly the reproductive rate has been going down and continue to go down quite dramatically. There could be genetic issues, there could be environmental issues, but I also wonder if there are societal issues. If humans really had a society around them before, and now they're sitting in front of the Facebook, and that's not quite a society, perhaps. Maybe we have changed. We are not the original humans anymore. We are some sort of electronic combination of human and machine.
Well, so this is not my field, and so the opinion I'm about to give you is not a scientific opinion. It's not uninformed by my background, but it's a personal opinion. The data are pretty clear that when you give women birth control and you give them the ability to decide whether or not they're going to have offspring, the utility of having offspring is outweighed, of having many offspring is outweighed by the utility of having few. That's not universally the case across human societies yet, but increasingly as societies become more wealthy, women make that choice. And so I don't think it's necessary. I think it's because raising kids is really, really hard and energetically
They're
demanding.
expensive.
They're expensive. And the calories required, and money is just another sort of a currency that you can translate into calories, right? The calories required to produce a human and get them to adulthood now and launch them successfully, it's an enormous investment. And I think people just simply often choose not to make that investment, the more sort of agency they have around it.
Yeah. So in conclusion, Susan, you are doing a lot of research in this area. So going back to non-human primates that you focus on, if you look forward next few years, what are the areas that you really want to go deeper into? What are the questions that you're really trying to explore looking forward?
Yeah. So I'm part of a research project that has many different arms, several different arms, and I have two particularly strong colleagues who are leading really fascinating research. Beth Archie at University of Notre Dame is doing a lot of really novel work on the microbiome and also on ways to monitor health in our population and trying to understand health metrics, because that's hard to do when you're just watching the animal observationally. But Beth is coming up with some clever ways. And then Jenny Tong, who is looking at genetics and epigenetics, and in the aggregate, we're all trying to understand how the environment gets under the skin to affect behavior and fitness outcomes, but also to try to understand how behavior evolves as a mechanism, as a way that animals, as a tool animals can use to manage their environment. So we're all interested in the evolution of behavior. I think one of the things that I'm just really curious about is understanding two things. One is understanding how the valence of social relationships matters. Not all we said social bonds affect survival, but not all social bonds are created equal, right? We know this in human societies, that you might live with your parents as an adult, and sometimes those relationships are fantastic, and sometimes it's very stressful. And we don't have very fine-grained data at the moment on the valence of relationships for the wild baboons, and I'd love to get that. And then another thing I'm just so curious about is understanding more about the maternal environment and how it affects her daughters and the maternal environment they create for their offspring. Those are the things that I'm really dying to understand more about.
Yes, fascinating research. Like I said, it feels like this is the right laboratory in an ironic way for us to understand ourselves, because there's too much noise on the human side these
Yeah.
are the things that
It's a simplified model of human societies. It's not a perfect model, but there's a lot of parallels that I think we can leverage to learn a lot about ourselves.
right. Excellent. Yeah, this has been great, Susan. Thanks so much for spending time with me.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Thank you.
Bye.